Welcome, everyone, to another Living Room Lecture Series with Historic Locust Grove. My name is Hannah Zimmerman, and I am the Marketing and Communications Director at Locust Grove, and I'm so pleased to be with you today from my dining room. You can let us know where you're watching from in the chat. The chat is going to be very important to our program today. That's how you'll interact with our speaker, Eric Brooks from Ashland. You'll ask questions there, and then we'll ask them for you at the end of the program. We'd also love if you told us where you were watching from in the chat. I see that we have someone from Boston, Massachusetts. So welcome from Boston, but maybe you're from Lexington or Louisville or Pasadena. Let us know where you're from and if this is your first lecture. We are super excited to have you with us today as Eric Brooks speaks about the enslaved community of Ashland. But first, to say a few words, I'm going to introduce our director, Dr. Carol Ely. Hello, Carol.
Hi. I am here in my office, which our big news for this week is that we are open to the public again for tours as of last Thursday. So on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, we're offering a self-guided tour of the house between 12 and 3. And also a new feature is a grounds tour, which does look a lot at the world of the enslaved people at Locust Grove, and that's at 10 a.m. It does not go in the house, it stays on the grounds. So if you're concerned about being in an indoor space, this is the tour for you. And it's at 10 a.m. on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And with these tours, you do need to reserve in advance, and you can do that online. And if you have any problems, I bet Hannah would be glad to help you. And she's already given out her email address. So we hope to see some of you. And if you are not yet ready to go out into the world, we understand, and we are going to continue to do a lot of programs virtually. And the one good thing about the pandemic, I guess I could say there's maybe one good thing, is it's given a lot of museums a chance to go back and look again at some of their programs, particularly as it relates to slavery and race. I mean, certainly that's been part of the national conversation during these last few months, and it's a long overdue reckoning. And along with Ashland, Locust Grove has done additional research, has started to put together new programming, and you'll see that unrolling over the next couple months. And we're excited to have the opportunity to bring these stories to the public. So I'm really eager to hear what's going on at Ashland. So I'll turn it back over to Hannah to continue this program.
Thank you so much, Carol. As Carol said, we are reopened to the public, and the best way to find out about everything that's happening at Locust Grove is to join our email mailing list. I'll put a link to do so in the chat. If you're already on the email mailing list, we send emails out every Friday, and if you're a member of Locust Grove, you always get advance notice of any programs. So we send out a little digest to members only, and then it goes out to the public. So we've got some really interesting programs coming up in August that we're very excited about. If you're a member, you'll find out tomorrow. If you're not a member, you'll find out on Friday. And that means you have today to become a member. So we're so excited that we're able to be open and also able to have virtual programs. A few quick housekeeping notes. Please leave your microphones turned off. We're going to ask questions in the chat. You can leave your video camera turned on so that Eric can see your smiling faces during the program. And yes, we're so pleased that you're with us. And now for a very special cocktail, I'm going to turn it over to Locust Grove's program director, Brian Cushing, with a special mint julep. Brian, what are we drinking today?
Thank you, Hannah. Welcome back to the Living Room Lecture Series. We've met this cocktail before. It's a mint julep, but we couldn't resist breaking it back out today because this is Henry Clay's own recipe for a mint julep. And it's great when people in the past actually write down how they do a thing for us. It makes it easier for us to interpret. And the really unique thing about this one, about Henry Clay's, is that this is the first documentation that I know of bourbon being used as the base spirit for a mint julep. That was very much not typical in the early days, and that lasted through the whole 19th century. They were using things like cognac and brandy, and whiskey and bourbon were listed as options in certain places, but usually not the core idea. But in the 1840s, Henry Clay wrote down his mint julep recipe, and it was a bourbon-based julep. It's very easy. As a matter of fact, I remember when I read the recipe, it seemed too easy, and I expected to be underwhelmed by it, but it's actually become one of my standards now. I was a little bit thrown by the lack of mixing in here. There's actually very little mixing that goes on, and I really think that that's part of the magic of this. So to get started, he called for a coin silver goblet. And now I looked up, tried to find some Victorian coin silver goblets, but they were a little bit cost prohibitive. So we're going to go with a run-of-the-mill silver-plated julep cup. Okay, this will do just fine. It'll do the same job. So it's a silver-plated julep cup. The first thing you do is you take some mint leaves that have been taken off of the stem. So these are some destemmed mint leaves. You put them in the inside of the cup, and you take a spoon, and you just kind of rub those along the inside of the cup and just kind of start releasing the oils of the mint onto the cup itself. So you rub those around just a little bit, and then you literally just take those back out and discard. The next part is you take some crushed ice. He said to fill the cup about halfway. You might want to go 3/4, depending on what kind of mood you're in. And this will start to cool the cup down. The cup's not pre-chilled. The ice will do that for you. Okay. The next thing he calls for is a jigger of bourbon. Jigger being about 2 ounces. Another way they would call for a 2-ounce measure in 19th century cocktails is by saying a wine glass. And this is a Victorian wine glass from right about that time, maybe a little bit later. And they also at the time measured in about 2 ounces. So if you're reading a 19th century recipe and it calls for a wine glass of something, it's not talking about the big bowl we have now. It's talking about 2 ounces of liquid. So, and this too, this is our bourbon. You can use whatever kind of bourbon you wanted. In Henry Clay's day, it didn't come in a labeled bottle. You would go and get a flask like this filled with bourbon from a barrel, like a tavern or something like this. And this is not an antique, but this was cast in the original mold. So this is what those flasks look like that they would get their whiskey in. So there's our 2 ounces of bourbon, and don't mix it. Just let it flow through there. And the next thing you do is you take about a teaspoon of sugar, put it in a separate receptacle, and pour some chilled water on top, and just kind of eyeball that. Give it enough to work around in. If you go online and you look for a modern adaptation of this recipe, a lot of them will tell you to substitute simple syrup. And if you do that, you will still get a tasty beverage, but you're going to be missing something because we're going to start to mix this. And since the water is chilled, the sugar is not going to perfectly combine with the water. You really need room temperature or warmer to get sugar to really combine with the water. So it's still going to be in a partially separated form. And you keep that rolling. And again, just pour it over the mixture. And don't mix. And what I really realized the magic of this one is the not perfectly combined forms of all the ingredients slowly combining together, and you pick up each individual one very nicely. Take you a couple of mint sprigs, rub them a little bit in your hand to start to release the scent. Plant those in there, a straw, and here's a taste of Henry Clay's preference from the 1840s of a mint julep. Here's to you, and throw it back to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Brian. So the key to this mint julep is to mix it, right? I'm supposed to mix the mint julep?
Don't mix it.
Don't mix it. Okay, I knew I missed a crucial step.
You'll understand why when you taste it.
All right. Well, now we do just want to once again, couple quick reminders. Leave your microphone off, keep your video camera on. The Living Room Lecture Series is sponsored in part by John and Jeannie Bezos. We're very grateful to them. And we're also grateful to today's speaker, Eric Brooks. Eric Brooks, are you ready to be introduced? I think we have to turn
I am indeed, yes. Thank you.
All right. Eric Brooks was born in Columbus, Ohio, and grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. He received a bachelor's degree in anthropology at Miami University, and after his graduation, went to Washington, D.C., where he worked for 6 months for the National Park Service as an interpretive ranger on the National Mall. Eric continued his career in Park Service Gray and Green for a year at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site in Oyster Bay, New York, and there he began his museum career as a museum technician. After a year and a half with the National Park Service, Eric received acceptance into the United States Peace Corps, where he served 2 years on the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean. In St. Lucia, Eric taught physical education at a secondary school, and after his Peace Corps career, returned to the U.S. and school to pursue a Master of Science in Museum Science at Texas Tech University. He received his master's in 1998 and finally returned home to Kentucky to take the position of curator and assistant director of Liberty Hall Historic Site, home of Kentucky's first Senator John Brown in Frankfort, Kentucky. After 4 years in Frankfort, Eric finally made it full circle to Lexington, where he became curator at Ashland in 2002. As curator at Ashland, Eric was responsible for managing the collection, creating an interpretation of the site, producing research on the site and its inhabitants, and anything else that happens to need doing and for which no one else is available. Other duties as assigned. Eric is currently past president of the board of the Kentucky Museum and Heritage of Alliance, Kentucky's organization for the museum and heritage professions. And we are so pleased to have him with us today as our living room lecture speaker on the enslaved at Ashland. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Hannah. It's very good to be here. I appreciate this opportunity very much. I'm very honored to be asked to speak to Locust Grove. It's always good to be with Locust Grove. I always enjoy working with other museums around the state, and certainly Locust Grove especially. They're very similar in many ways to Ashland. We have a lot of similar concerns and whatnot, so I thought this was a really great opportunity to do this program and discuss this subject. It's also great to be able to get out and do this again. I love to speak, and I love getting out of the office with people, and obviously lately that's not been possible. So I have not had many opportunities. In fact, I had 2 or 3 that were scheduled since when the pandemic began, would have happened already, that have obviously been canceled. So it's great to have an opportunity to do this virtually. I appreciate that, and appreciate all the help from Locust Grove. They've been great, and the organization they have for this is remarkable. And if invitation is the sincerest form of flattery, you can expect to be flattered a great deal in the near future, because this is really well done. So I appreciate that opportunity very much, and it's great to be here. Today I'm going to talk about the interpretation of slavery at Ashland, and I'm going to look at it over the whole length of time that we've been a museum, which is a pretty long time now. So I'm going to look at all of that, to talk about how it's changed, and specifically really focus on things that we've done very recently that have brought it to a whole new level. And I think we're very proud of those things, and very pleased that we've been able to do some of the things we have been able to do. And I know Locust Grove has been doing very similar things and has very similar concerns, similar issues, etc. So these are not uncommon in this field. Many institutions like ours are going through this process. So I'm pleased to be able to talk about what we've done. And certainly I'm not doing this because I'm the one that's done it all, or even the majority of it. It's been a team effort. It's been something we've done as a site. I've obviously been a part of that for a good while, but something that has been involved a lot of people, and we'll talk about some of those as we go through today. So very excited to be able to do that. And I'm going to now hit the old share screen button. And down here. Okay, hope everyone can see that. Okay, so the title of this program, Traces, Rediscovering Enslaved People at Ashland, comes from the tour that we have created, that we debuted earlier this year. And we thought that was a good title because what we've been doing is gathering the traces of these individuals that they've left here at Ashland or elsewhere, and bringing them back together to create a picture. And that obviously has lots of challenges, but it's been a very gratifying and interesting process to do that. So Ashland has been a museum, operated as a museum since 1950. We opened on April 12th of that year for the first time as an institution. foundation that operates Ashland began operation in 1948 after having been funded by the will of Henry Clay's great-granddaughter, Nanette McDowell Bullock. So we are very much the product of the family, and that their efforts make this possible. But we opened in 1950, and tours began at that time. And from that time, really, pretty much until the 80s, slavery was pretty well completely ignored and hidden. It was something that was not discussed, was not part of the tour. We didn't have any artifacts or anything out that led to that. So it was just simply not part of what was going on here. This photograph shows the tour being done probably in the mid 50s. The woman on the right with the large black bow on her dress is Lorraine C. She was everything. She was the only paid staff member here pretty much the entire time she worked here, which was from 1950 until 1985. So she holds the record for longevity at Ashland at 35 years. So anyway, throughout that period, it was something that was not discussed. Eventually, in the 80s, as we got along and more people became involved, and some of those people brought more professional experience, etc., mention at least of the topic occasionally occurred. But most of that was meant to trivialize or deflect it. It was not meant to really tell that story fully. At best, it acknowledged that there were people enslaved here, but not much more than that. And quite often it did things like make statements that Henry Clay was a kind master and that people who were enslaved here were happy, etc. Obviously, those statements are false and cannot be made, but that was where we were at that time. So into the 90s, we started making some effort to change that. Greater mention was made. But until my predecessor came, and he arrived here in late 1997, that wasn't very organized. And about that time, things started to get more organized. He made a great effort when he came to do a couple of really important things. He wanted to create a base from which a lot of work could be done. And he did that by organizing the collection, making sure everything was out of boxes and storage and in drawers and whatever, and was fully organized and stored properly. So that was really important. That allowed us to more fully access the collection and make it part of the tour. But the other thing he did was to take our tour and go through everything that we discussed and find sources for it. So he validated it, he sourced it, he made sure that we weren't saying anything that we couldn't back up. And that meant, with respect to slavery, that he was now providing sources for what we were saying regarding slavery and providing interpretation that was more correct. And, Henry Clay enslaved people, they talked about what they did, etc. But it still wasn't terribly expensive. This is the back stairwell at Ashland. That's actually a servant's stairs installed by Henry Clay's granddaughter and grandson-in-law to allow their African-American servants, who were paid, hired people, to access the house without being seen. It was then and is today where the tour ends. That's when you exit the house from the tour, that's where you exit, through that door. And for a long time, slavery was interpreted in that little tiny space. So you'll see a couple of photos there. Those are of some of the people that worked here in the McDowell era. That was about all we had. And the problems with that were many. It wasn't terribly comfortable, so you couldn't stand there very long. It was the last thing in the tour, so if a docent were behind, they would typically kind of rush through that or skip over it because they had to get done. So it just wasn't conducive to fully telling the story, and we didn't really have much in the way of artifacts to really do that. And that's how we do what we do here. Our tour is based in artifacts. So when I arrived, this is how I found things. And I still found people saying the kind master thing and things of that nature, things that were just not appropriate. So I began to work toward addressing that and trying to deal with that. One of the things I did in about 2004 was a 10-day symposium at Bellmead Plantation in Nashville, which is another historic site, historic home. Very nice, highly recommended if you're in Nashville, well worth a visit. They did a symposium in which they used a book called Representations of Slavery, Race and Ideology in Southern Plantation Museums by Jennifer Eichstedt and Stephen Small, which talks about a study they made by visiting a bunch of museums, I believe in Virginia, Louisiana, and maybe Mississippi, to look at how slavery was interpreted. And at that time, they found 4 stages of interpretation. Complete obliteration, which is what we had been doing for a long time, and then minimization, trivialization, deflection, which was kind of where we were, segregation, wherein the subject is discussed and perhaps to some degree fully, but it is still isolated in a small area and not integrated throughout the tour, and then of course integration, wherein the subject is discussed, it is discussed appropriately and fully, and it is done throughout the tour, not just in one place. So I wanted to move along through this process, through these stages, to try to move us forward, and that provided some framework for doing that. So I started working on that, and we went through some personnel changes and things, so we made some progress, but it wasn't fully embraced or enforced. But in 2010, we made a significant change. We took a room on the 2nd floor of the home and reinterpreted the space to be Henry Clay's dressing room. And we did that as a way to create a space where we could more fully interpret slavery at Ashland. And so we have lots of artifacts, we have reproductions of images of enslaved people, we have documents. The map to the right is a map of Liberia. We talk about the ACS, so we had a lot of chances to talk about this material, to discuss it fully, and to do it with artifacts that people could see to reinforce what we were talking about. That was a big change. That required a lot of effort. Getting the artifacts relocated was no simple process. Obviously we had to produce some of the material that we put up. The map had to be generated. Some of the other images and documents had to be reproduced, etc. So that was a lot of effort, but it paid off, and I think it made the tour a lot better. But we were still very much in a segregated mode. We were talking about it in isolation, not throughout. We had also redone outdoor signage and created some signage to identify the location of the slave quarters, which I'll come back to. But again, weren't doing it systematically at that point. That was where we needed to go. When we did the dressing room in 2010, we kind of laid down an institutional policy of certain words like enslaved person versus slave, enslaver versus slave owner, etc., and made a greater effort to enforcement, and that helped. We certainly moved forward at that point. More people were in compliance. We got better results with that, but we still had a long ways to go. Another thing that happened, and this wasn't something we initiated, but we embraced it, and it's been incredibly valuable to us, was that we had a person come to us who wanted to present as one of the enslaved at Ashland. We were approached by a woman named Yvonne Giles. Yvonne is a good friend of the estate, and someone that if you do research on African Americans in Lexington, you're going to get to know. She's been doing it a really long time, and everybody knows if you're doing African American research, call Yvonne, because she's going to have info and can help with it. Yvonne's a good friend of mine. I've worked with her a good long time now. She had a friend named Elizabeth Lawson who wanted to present Charlotte Dupuy. Charlotte is a central figure in the story of slavery at Ashland. She was enslaved at Ashland a great many years. She actually sued Henry Clay for her freedom and that of her children in 1829. It's a really important story. So she said, I want to do this. We said, that would be really great. There's a lot of value in that. So we started working with her, providing documents, research, discussing various points of interpretation, talking about what we talked about in the story, etc., so that what we were doing would coalesce and mesh. She began developing her story and eventually presented it at Ashland. This is Elizabeth Aslotty. This is taken at our Living History event, which is an event we started in 2012, and this was central to it. This has always been, every year we've done it. We did it right up through last year. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to do it this year because of the nature of the event. Maybe we'll find some ways to do something virtually, but I don't think that's going to happen this year, and that's unfortunate. But we've been bringing the freshman class from Henry Clay High School over, all of them, all 400 or whatever of them, and so they get to see this and learn about their namesake and who he was, and about the area where their school is located. So anyway, it's just been vitally important, and it really connects. The students really get a lot out of this, and I think they really connect to her performance. And around that time, she submitted it to the Kentucky Humanities Council Chautauqua program, and they accepted it. And she's been performing. I don't know exactly when it was accepted, 2014 maybe, something like that. But she's been performing ever since. And I think she's actually been to Locust Grove at least once. So she's really great. If you haven't had her, definitely well worth having. But she's really expanded that story to a whole new audience for us and presents it in a way that no one else could. That's really dramatic and important, and that's been a tremendous asset in what we've been doing relative to slavery. So we were just so grateful that she's been able and willing to do that. So in the last several years, we recognized that we needed to take another step, and that step needed to not just talk about slavery, but talk about slavery systematically across our signature tour and across other programming, to bring into line all of our panels and exhibits and whatever that we had that related to Ashland, to include information about slavery that was consistent. But we also needed to present it in a way that did so, that gave the perspective of the people enslaved at Ashland and what their life and experience was like. That's definitely challenging, no question about it. A lot of complications in that, but that's what we needed to do. So we began a process that would result in the Traces of Slavery at Ashland tour. And a big step in that process was bringing on board Cameron Walpole. Cameron is our equivalent of Caitlin, I guess, manager of tours and education. She came on board in 2018, was a former weekend manager here. She came back to Ashland. She had been for several years on staff at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So she had significant experience in dealing with the interpretation of difficult subjects and dealing with issues of perspective and bringing that perspective. It was instrumental in moving us forward. She helped us understand what we needed to do in that regard. And she got a grant from the Kentucky Historical Society, their local history fund program, to hire 2 consultants. We hired a woman named Amy Taylor, who's a professor at UK, whose primary areas of research include slavery and African Americans. In fact, she published a book called Embattled Freedom, which has won several prizes. A really neat book about enslaved people escaping slavery and going into joining the Union Army and whatnot during the Civil War. So she was very valuable as a resource. We also hired a woman named Ashley Smith. Ashley Smith runs an organization called Black Soil, is a nonprofit whose goal is to work with African Americans in agriculture, to reconnect African Americans to agriculture in this state. So again, someone who's been very, very valuable in terms of perspective, etc. We needed to get outside people involved, because after a certain point, you looking at yourself, you can only see so much. So we needed other people to really help us to put this together, and they gave us a lot of information and ideas, and were instrumental in us being able to do that. So we began this process of thinking about and trying to create a tour. And one of the big steps in that was collating the information that we have on slavery at Ashland. I had a whole drawer full of information from a variety of sources. We had been gathering it for years, from the papers of Henry Clay, from newspapers and other documents, census records, etc. But what we had never done was collate it into a single document where we could access the information quickly and look at it all comprehensively to extract from it pieces and parts that could become the tour. So we did that. I had 3 interns work on that. This is one of them. That's Lane. Lane was one of the people that helped and was very instrumental in this. Lane Hedrick, Haley Marie, and Shelley Lucas were the other interns that worked on this project. And the result is a single document, kind of spiral bound, that the first part of it is just a series of names. And under those names, we have a listing of all the information we have about that individual. Then it's broken apart by subject. So if I wanted to look up what we have on enslaved people at Ashland in the hemp business, I have a whole section for that. So there are all kinds of different ways that it's broken out so that I can look up that information quickly if I need a piece of information on a particular topic. This allowed us to develop a list of things that we needed to talk about, wanted to talk about, and where and what the information was on those things. So incredible resource that informed the tour. And so we start generating all these threads, all this information, processing it, and that started to coalesce in ways that we could see, ways we could put it together, places on the site that we would go with it. One of the decisions we had to make was, is this a grounds tour or is this a house tour? And we ended up doing something that was both. It starts outside, it comes inside. And I think that's really effective for a variety of reasons. That worked out really, really well for us. So I'm glad that we did that. As we went, one of the things we needed to do is get the involvement of the public and get public opinion on what we were talking about, what we needed to talk about. We needed to know what the public thought of Ashland, especially what African Americans thought about Ashland and wanted to know from Ashland. So about a year ago, we had a public listening session in town. This is a photo of the group discussion that we had as part of that. And it involved a number of parts. We had this group discussion. We had a series of posters that we hung up with questions where people could come write responses that provided a written record of certain information that we needed about various topics. We provided an opportunity for people to provide us contact info, personal info, so that we could reach back to them. And we actually got some of these people to come back later to take the tour. We provided an opportunity if people had information about slavery at Ashland or slavery in their family or whatever, we could do oral histories. We recorded one or two of those. I also set up a station where I could discuss genealogy if people had genealogical information or wanted to look for it, including a large poster that included all of the names we have of enslaved people at Ashland. And I set up a computer and other paperwork in case people had artifacts that they wanted to bring in. And we made it known we were interested in seeing artifacts relating to Ashland, slavery at Ashland, or that might be informative to us. And we actually got one really, really important artifact out of that. It's not one we've used a great deal yet because it's a rather complicated artifact. It is a political cartoon made for the 1844 presidential campaign, in which Henry Clay is having a conversation with his enslaved manservant, Charles Dupuy. And Charles is depicted in a very racist manner. He is speaking in Negro dialect, so it is obviously a very racist depiction. And it's meant to impugn Henry Clay and his views on slavery, and particularly that he's taking advice from an enslaved person. So interpreting it is something that is very difficult to do. It has to be done very carefully because of the racist nature of the item. But it's an incredibly important piece that tells us some very important things about Charles, not least of which is that he was so well known that he could be part of a political cartoon. So it's a really important piece to have. And so far as I've been able to determine at this point, it is singular. There are no others. So that we have it is really a remarkable thing. And it's a great piece to have in the collection. So after we did this, we took this information and used it to refine the tour and inform the tour. And we made sure that when we created the tour, we addressed the concerns, the questions, the areas of interest that came out of this meeting. So I think that made a much, much better tour than it otherwise would have been. And by late fall, November, I guess, in there, we started actually doing test tours. We did it for people who would come to our public listening day. We did it for people inside the organization. We did it from a couple of other targeted groups. And what we wanted to find out was, what do you think of this? Are there concerns that you have? Is there anything we're saying that you think is not accurate or needs to be explained? And that provided, again, a lot of valuable data for evaluating the tour and refining the tour. Another thing we did is acquire a tablet, which we use for this tour. We also set it up that we can use it for other tours. But on this tour, it presents a lot of information beyond the buildings and physical features that we look at. Outside, particularly, we aren't using artifacts, so it informs the tour and provides additional audiovisual material to go with it, which is really useful. One of the most powerful things we do with the tablet is that we have a speech made by a man who was enslaved at Ashland, who escaped on the Underground Railroad and made this speech when he got to Canada. It's really a fascinating speech about slavery at Ashland. We had a local actor, theater manager, record that for us. So we play that speech, and that is a really, really powerful, remarkable thing to be able to do. So that is made possible through this technology. And that technology is all important. Someday I hope we'll have even more tablets to be able to use more widely across tours. I think this has been something that I had some questions about, but it's been amazingly successful. And it's really quite easy to use. So once we launched the tour, this year when we opened for tours every year, beginning of March. So this year it was March 3rd, I think. We ended up being open for a total of 10 tour days before we shut down. And we did the tour 4 or 5 times in there. So not a lot. And then we shut down, and we were closed from March 13th until June 16th. So about 3 months. And that was tough. I mean, it was unfortunate that we had done all that we had done and had this product ready to go and wanted people to experience it and had great hopes for that over that time and weren't able to do that. That was difficult. But when we reopened on the 16th, we started our offering that tour pretty much every day, and it's been a success. I had sold it out pretty much, or at least offered it, and people have taken it pretty much every day. And I think the response to it has been really excellent so far. Obviously, like I say, the number of people who have taken it is not as great as we hoped it might be. We haven't been able to offer it to groups, school children, that sort of thing. So there's a lot that we still have yet to do, but I think so far the response has been really, really good, and it's worked really well. In addition to what we did on Traces, we revised our signature tour script so that slavery is now integrated throughout the tour, and I think it's a much better tour as a result. We are revising the text panel we have on the grounds near the slave quarters to bring it into line with our slavery interpretation. We've added a lot of material to the website on the subject, so we've just done a lot of things to try to integrate everything that we do with what we're now saying about slavery. So that's been a really important effort as well, to make sure that everything is lined up. So what have we discovered in this process? What information are we now discussing maybe we didn't discuss before, or that we're looking at in a new way? So first of all, we have some basic facts. We've known some of these things, but we really kind of focused in on them now. First of all, we have a list now of 122 names of people enslaved at Ashland that we have extracted from a wide range of documents. That gives us some sort of number that is an approximation of the total size of the population of enslaved people at Ashland. I don't know that it's absolute. In fact, I suspect it's not. I suspect there are names we don't have for a variety of reasons. And I would also suspect that there are names that appear more than once in that list that we may have assumed were multiple people that are actually the same people. It can be very difficult to tell, especially if you have a name, for example, in a document in 1820, if that name is the same name as or if that person is the same person with that name in a document, say in 1845. That's a long period of time. And if you don't have anything in between, it can be difficult to determine that. But that's a good start. That's a good estimation. We know that Henry Clay purchased 60. So that gives us, again, some idea of how active he was at purchasing and enslaving people in this way. That's a significant number. That's important. From census records, we have now determined that there were at least 8 slave quarters near the mansion or somewhere on this half of the property, and that at some point there were 5 on the other half of the property. Now, we aren't sure whether that means 8 individual quarters or, for example, 8 buildings that were divided in the middle, which were really a total of 16 quarters. We don't know. There's a lot we don't know about the slave quarters, but it is great that we at least have those numbers. Again, we have really a good firm frame that gives people a way to appreciate the magnitude of slavery at Ashland that we didn't have as firmly before. One of the things that we did with this tour is acquire what is possibly the most important artifact in the collection, certainly one of them. This artifact is a drawing of a man named Charles Dupuy. It is a drawing of an enslaved African American at Ashland. We actually have two images of enslaved people at Ashland. The other is of his father. It's a photograph. The photograph we have very little information about. We don't know when it was taken. We aren't even sure where. It appears to be perhaps down in Lexington, down in town. And the only reason we know it's him is that somebody wrote in by hand Aaron under the picture. So we don't know who did that. So there are a lot of questions. But this thing, we have a full documentation of. This picture was drawn right here in the house on November the 20th, 1842, by an artist named John Nagel. Nagel was here to paint a very important painting of Henry Clay. He drew Charles while he was here for his own personal collection. And he did that because Charles, by that point, had taken over a lot of his father's duties as Henry Clay's valet and as sort of the main operator of the home. He would have welcomed guests, etc. And when John Nagel was here, he did things like set the fire in the room where John Nagel drew and opened his windows. So they got to know each other. So a very important person in that regard. And that's why this was done. Aaron and Lottie were enslaved here a great many years. Aaron was enslaved at least 67 years by the Clay family. Lottie was enslaved about, I guess, probably 20 less than that, but still a very long time. They had two children, Charles and Mary Ann. This is, like I said, one of the two. We have images of, he eventually was emancipated. He stayed on as a paid employee for a period of time. He appears to have, based on the records we have found, married a free woman of color, and they had a number of children. And eventually, they relocated to Washington, D.C., where he worked as a laborer and mover of goods, a cartman. We don't know when he died or where he's buried or anything like that, but having this is about as powerful a thing as we could hope to have for our interpretation of slavery at Ashland, and it hangs right inside the front door. So it's the first artifact you see on our signature tour, and it is the last artifact you see on the Traces tour. So it's an incredibly important foundational artifact for those two tours. This was a process that actually took about 20 years. We became aware of this when the guy that at that time owned it sent a photograph of it to my predecessor, and my predecessor gained permission to exhibit the photo, which we did. And over time, he and then I had communication with the owner, and it passed to his nephew. But eventually, we were able, last year I contacted the owner and said, you know, we're doing this tour. We're in this new phase of things. This is a really important time. We'd love to bring this to Ashland. And we were able to work it out. So you know, it's been a really long process, but it really is gratifying to have completed it. And it does prove the mantra that persistence and patience do pay off. Not my strongest suit. I'm not known as a patient person. In this case, however, I'm glad I played the game this way and it worked out. So really an important piece to have, and something that has been a really important part of our tour. Sexual exploitation is a really challenging subject to deal with regard to slavery. It's one of those that's just not comfortable, particularly, any way you look at it, but it's a reality that enslaved women faced on an ongoing basis. And it was a reality they faced widely, more often than not, in places where people were enslaved, who then were sexually exploited. That is now something that is revealed in the research, and when you read accounts of enslavement, etc., it's clearly something that happened often. And so we felt it was important to recognize that fact, but also to consider whether it happened at Ashland. Were there any women here who were sexually exploited, and what were the results of those exploitations? Were there any people born of such sexual exploitation? And we found several pieces of documentation that indicated that. We can't prove any of them. You know, there's some information that is conveyed. There are things about each source that might be valid and that lend the possibility of validity. There are other things about each source that argue against their validity. We felt that it was important to acknowledge these sources, to discuss these sources, and allow people to make their own judgment as to what happened and to accept the possibility and in fact even perhaps probability that it happened at Ashland. And several of these sources indicate the possibility, all of the sources really indicate the possibility that the sexual exploitations resulted in children. Now, we don't have any children that we can point at, any descendants we can point out right now that we could say are definitely descended from the exploitation of enslaved women by people here at Ashland. But we have to acknowledge that possibility exists. One of the documents that we refer to is this letter. This comes from the Filson Historical Society there in Louisville. You can go see it there. It is dated May 25th, 1844. It's a letter from a guy who has just established a plantation in Mississippi, and he's writing to his brother, I think he's in New Jersey or something, somewhere up north, about his new plantation and things going on, and he gets into politics. And on page 3, he spends a great deal of time talking about Henry Clay and about whether Henry Clay is someone people might vote for and who might vote for him. And he points out this issue that he sees, which is that Henry Clay had exploited a woman at Ashland, and he wasn't even willing to be honest about that, like, say, Richard Minter Johnson, who was a plantation owner in Scott County and eventually vice president of the United States, who openly exploited a woman on his plantation. And it was widely known and discussed. There's actually a really great book called Great Crossings, which is by an author named Christina Snyder. It's a book that was extremely influential to me in thinking about all of this. I think it's one of the better books I've read about the whole issue of race in the 19th century. And it talks about, it's all focused on Richard Minter Johnson's plantation and the woman that he exploited, but it also deals with the school that was operated there to educate Choctaws and other Native Americans. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. And that's where I learned about this letter. But he goes on to say the story that he heard, which he heard from an overseer of Henry Clay's, a man, this would have been in 1840, and that man would have been a man named Albert Floria, that Clay had purchased a young girl in her teens, who was of mixed race. Because he was attracted to her, she was hired ostensibly to manage the chicken coop, which she did. One day, Lucretia found him in her quarters, sexually exploiting her and ministering to her more lovingly than he did Lucretia. And that there were several children that were a product of this relationship, and that he had met these children. Now, can I prove any of this? No. He never says the name, so I don't know. I can't verify who this was at this point. I can't prove any of this, but it's difficult to ignore a document where there's no other apparent motive for making such a claim. And he cites a source, and he says Albert Floria was his source. I don't know. Bottom line is, we know the source exists. It is incumbent on us to acknowledge that and to allow people to contemplate it and draw their own conclusions from it as part of what we're doing. And in so doing, to help people understand that sexual exploitation was a real and regular and really awful part of the enslavement of people in this country. Another thing that we've done recently, relatively, is, and certainly done it with our tour, is allow the voices of people who were enslaved, who have things to say about enslavement at Ashland, to be heard. We have two good sources for that. This comes from one of them. That comes from a slave narrative called The Kidnapped and the Ransomed. It is the narrative of Peter and Venus Still, who were enslaved for over 40 years. And apparently it was published by a woman named Kate E.R. Picard. She taught at a school in Alabama where Peter worked. And I think she heard the story from Peter, wrote it up, and published it. It's a fascinating story. If you haven't read it, I'll put up there, maybe, well, I don't know if you can see it with my background. But anyway, it's a great book, well worth a read. I would highly recommend accessing slave narratives as a way to understand slavery. Hearing it from the people who were enslaved is about as powerful a way as you can. So I really recommend that. And in this book, he talks about an incident wherein Aaron Dupuy, Henry Clay's enslaved valet and carriage driver, was intoxicated at one point, causing him to be unable to drive the Clays home. Lucretia actually told Henry to have him whipped. So again, one of the things this reinforces is that it wasn't just men, it was also women who engaged in the act of enslavement and in the various parts of that, including punishment, etc. So it isn't right to exclude them. They need to be mentioned as part of that. But it's also a really neat, interesting story. Apparently, Aaron was told that he was going to be whipped by another enslaved person who had heard the story while working in the room where Henry and Lucretia and the overseer were discussing it. And he uses that information to prepare for the event, and he overpowers the overseer and whips the overseer. And according to Peter, received no further punishment because Clay had said that had been enough whipping. Now, I think he might well have gotten whipped later, and we just don't know about it. But there is this engraving as well, which is really a remarkable thing. So that's a really interesting story that comes from this slave narrative. The other is Lewis Richardson's speech, which I mentioned earlier. This is a map. Amherstburg is, you can see up there north of Ohio. That's where he went. That's where he gave the speech. If you want to hear it, there's a recording of it on our website. Also a transcription of it. It's a very powerful statement. He talks about the clothing, the rations that the enslaved were given, the whipping he received, the decision he and his wife made for him to flee on the Underground Railroad, leaving her behind and perhaps never to see him again. It's an incredible document. And to be able to let them speak is a remarkable thing. So that's been a real important part of what we did. Ashland was a hemp plantation, much like Locust Grove. The majority of people enslaved here were enslaved in the production of hemp. And so we had a real need to document that and be able to discuss that more fully. This is from a farm journal from here at Ashland that is over at UK. We own one, but there's very little in it about enslaved people. It's mostly about livestock. But this one contains all the documents relating to the hemp. And this is a document that shows hemp being broken, which is the way the fiber is removed from the woody inner part, by enslaved people in January of 1852. This is the last crop in Henry Clay's lifetime that is processed. You can see the numbers, those are weights. And oftentimes they're being expected to break over 100 pounds of hemp in a day. So they'd be doing this from dawn to dusk. This is being done in January and February when it's really, really cold. And they often had very little clothing with which to protect themselves, and it was a very nasty, dirty job. It created a lot of particulate matter, which was often inhaled, causing lung problems, and just the backbreaking nature of it had to be very brutal to the people doing it. So we now have this document. We use this in the tour. We've actually blown it up, and it's mounted in the study in the house where we talk about it on the signature tour. So it is a very visual reminder of the reality of that. I think that's really important. And it's also a really important opportunity for people to see the names of the enslaved. Well, the more those names are said and spoken, the more those people live on, the more that their legacies, their stories are preserved. So I think that's a really great opportunity as well. Another thing that we've done is bring into play the farm road. It's kind of hard to see here. You see the road that goes horizontally across the screen. That's a paved path, and there's a paved path that intersects it diagonally. If you look straight ahead of that, between those trees is a depression. That's an old farm road that goes back to Henry Clay's time, and that's where the slave quarters were. So we start our tour of Traces tour there. So people are starting the tour where the enslaved people live, and we talk a lot about life in the slave quarters. And that's where our slave panel is as well, our slavery panel is as well, which we've just rewritten, and we'll be reproducing a new one to go there. So it's great to incorporate that piece of the estate. One of the other things that we did when we created the tour and as we started to create this interpretation is determine and decide that we would not have events or rent out anything along that roadway and right near it to preserve that as a peaceful place because of the people that lived there and what went on there. We thought that was critically important. So we don't use that little space right along there. So that's been an important step for us. So we've done a lot. We have a lot more to do. This is not an end. This is a beginning. This is another step down the road. So we know a lot about what happened with the people who were enslaved here during the time that they were enslaved here. What we have not yet done is follow that along and to determine where they went and what they did after enslavement at Ashland, whether that's later on, during the Civil War or after the war when slavery legally ended, or in cases of people who were emancipated or otherwise left, like Louis Richardson. We know he escaped on the Underground Railroad, but that's all we know. The last event in his life we have documentation of is the speech he gave in Canada. We don't know where he went, what he did, or when he died. So we're trying to find those things out. That's very challenging to do because of the way records were kept regarding the enslaved and the difficulty of connecting those to records that are found once they become free. So we're working at that. That's a research project. I enjoy research projects, so that's something I'm going to continue working on in the future. We want to build a descendant community. We don't now have a community of people who believe themselves to be descended from the enslaved people enslaved at Ashland. We're working at that. That's both a research problem and an issue of getting out that we want to create this and inviting people to come to us to bring information they may have and working with those people to thence be able to determine that they are part of such a community and get them involved. So that's another thing that I think as we go forward, we hope to accomplish in the relatively near future. As you saw with the farm road, there is nothing there now of the slave quarters at Ashland. Those quarters were destroyed, I think, probably by Henry Clay's granddaughter and grandson-in-law about 1882 or so, and they were destroyed very thoroughly. Archaeologically, we have done a lot of work there. What we have found is that we're not just talking about bricks, we're talking about rubble, little tiny chunks of things. So there's not enough there even necessarily to be really certain how big they were, whether they were divided into multiple units or whatever. So we're going to have to do some work to try to address that so that people can see what was there and have some idea of it. So hopefully, whether that's putting down foundation stones to lay out a foundational set of what one looked like or building a building, I don't know. We haven't made that decision yet, but that's another area on which we intend to work. We would like to create a memorial to the people enslaved at Ashland. We've done a lot of things that tell that story, a lot of informational things. This would be more a dedication thing, a place to come and reflect, a place for people to come and deal with their emotions relating to enslavement, a place to recognize what they went through, etc. This would probably be artistic in nature, and there are a lot of different forms that might take. Again, we haven't made any final decisions on how that will work, but that's another piece of this puzzle that we wish to add. And of course, I'm continuing searching for artifacts relating to enslavement at Ashland. Again, there aren't a lot of those. Family didn't keep many of those. I don't know of a lot of others that are out there, but if I can find anything, I would love to find it and bring it back. Anything that we can bring here that helps us tell the story and expands the story is certainly something we want to have. If you would like to know more, you can visit our website, henryclay.org. There's a lot of information there. We have developed a section on slavery at Ashland, which tells the story generally. And then to the side of that, if you go to our website and click Learn at the top, you'll see Slavery at Ashland. If you hover on that, you'll also see a thing pop out to the side, which says, I think it's bios of enslaved, something like that. And what we've created are little small biographies of people enslaved at Ashland, and we've attached to those documents and artifacts that relate to those people so that you can learn all that stuff. For example, Louis Richardson's speech and the recording. So that's all there. So it's something that you can access on your own. There's lots of other information about the estate. We're continuing to add to that and develop that. So there will be more in the very near future. You can also book tours there. And if you want to take the Traces tour, it's offered every day, Tuesday through Saturday at 1 o'clock. We have capacity currently for 2 groups of 4. So not a lot of people, but we can get some people on it. And we'd love to see you. So you can book that on the website as well. Visit our museum store. We have a lot of interesting things there for sale. So feel free to check that out. And lastly, the reason I got invited to this, to some extent, is that I'm a good friend of Caitlin's. I've known Caitlin a pretty long time now. I would guess we're getting on around 10 years or so. Caitlin came to Ashland as an intern. She was a college student. She did an internship. She actually worked for me up here in the office. Did a lot of things relating to cataloging. I think I actually still have a login for her in my collections catalog because I haven't bothered to purge a lot of people. But anyway, she did a lot of work here and then became a weekend manager at Ashland, and ran the estate on the weekends. And it was just a wonderful asset to the estate. Great person to have around. Lots of fun. That's Caitlin. That's in 2012. That was our first living history event. And she, at that event, was doing a first person portrayal of Josephine Russell Irwin Clay. She was Henry Clay's, well, first she was Henry Clay's granddaughter-in-law, and then she was Henry Clay's daughter-in-law. That's a long story. There's a whole other PowerPoint for that. But anyway, she was portraying Josephine. Her first husband, Henry Clay's grandson, Eugene Irwin, was killed at the Battle of Vicksburg. And she came back through Union lines to Independence, Missouri, where they lived, and brought with her his uniform coat with the bullet hole and blood stain on it and the flag under which he died in her skirts. So that's what she's depicting here. Caitlin actually made that flag. We still use it. That's a Van Doren flag, which is a flag produced by a Civil War general from Missouri, and under which Missouri troops fought. Not one of the more well-known flags, but it is a flag, and we certainly still use it. So that was a very fun day. We had a lot of fun days when Caitlin was here. It's greatly pleasing to me that Caitlin has been so successful and done so well, and is such a integral and vibrant part of the museum community in our state and at Locust Grove. She's done some great things, and I had no doubt she would. When I get an intern, one of the first things I usually do is give them be forewarned, you're not going to get rich doing this, nor is it necessarily easy to do because there are jobs. And Caitlin was immediately like, I don't care, I'm going to do it. And she did it, and I knew she would. That's kind of how Caitlin is. She decides to do it, it's going to get done, and that's just that. So it's great to be seeing Caitlin and working with Caitlin and all of that. So anyway, I'd be pleased to take questions of any sort.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I just have to say, we're the lucky ones now because Locust Grove's got Caitlin Tisdale on it. So while Caitlin's ears are burning, she is going to be our question asker today. So if you haven't met Caitlin before, she joined our staff right before the pandemic. I think the day we closed was her 1-month anniversary. And she is our Director of Education and Family Programs. So Caitlin, welcome. What questions do we have today?
Hello, everyone. Eric, thank you so much. I'm so flattered, and I was so excited to be able to ask you to join us for a lecture. As soon as we started this series, I knew you'd be perfect for it. And Ashland is still a place that I'm very passionate about, and you guys are doing some big, incredible work. Congratulations to you and your entire team for this. This is really well done. Locust Grove, we're in a bit of a different situation here in Louisville. We were a mixed farm. Farmington, actually, in Louisville was a hemp plantation, but we were a mixed-use farm. The Cron family did not do any sort of plantation work. So it's a little bit different, but we are also really working on reinterpreting our history of the enslaved here. We are updating our tour. We've had extensive research by staff and some great volunteers. We're part of several different new community initiatives, working with Andrea Merriweather, Louisville Tourism. We're working on reinterpreting our woodshop into an enslaved dwelling, partnering with U of L African American Theater Program. I mean, we have all sorts of stuff up our sleeve, and we can't wait to really start hammering this stuff out to the public when we're allowed to have groups again. Now, we do have several questions. Eric, are you ready?
Yep.
All right. First, we have, do we know how many of the 122 enslaved people were male and female?
I can figure that out. I don't have that information off the top of my head, but I can pull the list and count it up. That's a good thing to do. I will do that.
Awesome. See, you get great things from questions.
Yes, indeed.
Next question. Have they found foundations of any slave cabins? How do they know that's where the slave cabins were?
The answer to that is no, we don't have foundations, but there is evidence in that location of material that would have been found in slave quarters. So we have some historical accounts that talk about slave quarters at Ashland, talk about them being brick, talk generally about them being located, in a certain vicinity of the house. Plus, at places like Ashland, you typically had slave quarters in two locations. You had them somewhere near what would be sort of the residential and family section of the farm, where the mansion was, where the garden was, uh, outbuildings that supported all of that. And that's what would have been the ones down by the farm road. There would have been another set of quarters further out on the farm, which we have never found at all. These probably were closer to where Henry Clay's son John lived, which, if you're familiar with Lexington, was near Tate's Creek Road, and actually fairly close to what is today Christ the King Church and the Chevy Chase Anglican Church that's across the road. But we don't know where those exactly were. So we had some idea where to look. We had archaeology that was done. And so based on the period accounts and then the archaeology, we were able to look at what we found there, and what we found fits with what you would expect to find in an area where there were slave quarters. Like I say, those were completely obliterated. I mean, there's not even a whole brick there, really. It's little tiny chunks, excuse me. So it's very difficult to know how big they were. Like I say, were they a rectangular structure divided into two squares or something else? The archaeology supports the idea that they were brick. There are some other things that were found archaeologically, like window glass, which is interesting. The problem is, after Henry Clay's son James died and his wife sold the property, she sold it to what was the forerunner of the University of Kentucky. So this was a college campus for 13 years. And they used every structure on the property because they had very little money. And so they couldn't just build what they needed. They used everything that was there. And I suspect, and I have sources that sort of indicate that those structures were used probably as housing for students. And so they may have fixed them up, put windows in and things like that that weren't there. So what we are finding is skewed by the fact that they were used as things other than slave quarters after the fact. So that's a very difficult thing. It's unfortunate that we don't have more structures of that sort. That would be really great. That would really go a long way to completing our picture. But that's what we found so far.
Right. Another question. Do you have much documentation of enslaved people at Ashland dealing with his racehorses or with horses in general?
Yes. We have a number of people mentioned as groom or whatever. I don't think there's any question that all of the work of training and raising and breeding the horses was done by enslaved people. We have a few names that show up with Henry Clay's son John, and that later moved from here over to Ashland on Tate's Creek. So we do have that. Yes, we have some of that documentation, and that's in our document we talk about. We also have a lot of information about African Americans involved in the horse business at Ashland after the A&M era, later on.
Right.
That's really interesting and important information. The last African American jockey to win the Kentucky Derby won the Derby in 1902 aboard a horse called Allenadale. He rode for Henry Clay's great-grandson, Thomas Clay McDowell, on a horse McDowell owned. So we have a really important story there that we do on our signature tour. And that horse was trained by a man named Courtney Matthews, who was also African American, although he is not credited as such. Not credited as having trained the horse, I mean.
Right.
So yes, we do certainly have that.
So everyone, visit Ashland and you'll get more information on those tours. Next question. Were the quarters destroyed to try and hide the history or just because of renovations, etc.? You may have already touched on this a bit, but that's an interesting question.
Well, we don't know. I think hiding the history was possibly part of it. I think the decision that, that's done and we don't need to have things around probably factored into it. The other thing that I think probably brought it about was that by the time the McDowells bought the property in 1882, it had been a college campus and then for 4 years was rented out to tenant farmers. And the result of that was that it was in pretty rough shape when they got it. And I suspect those structures were in pretty bad shape and there was no need for them. So there was no reason, to save any part of that. They just bulldozed it and cleared it and went on. So I think that it was a combination of lack of need, poor condition, and a desire to eliminate reminders of a painful past.
Right. Is there a burial ground on the property for the enslaved persons?
Not that we have ever found. There's been a lot of conversation about that. There may have been. I don't recall any specific reference that I have come across that says an enslaved person was buried in a specific place, with the one exception of Aaron Dupuy. He actually had an obituary in the paper, and it says that he was buried in a cemetery in town, which no longer exists. Our belief is that his remains were moved to another cemetery for African Americans, which does still exist. Unfortunately, the headstone that he apparently had was lost, and so that's not there now, which is really sad because now I don't know where he is.
Right.
But as far as people being buried here, we've never found evidence for that. They may have been, but if they were, we have not encountered that at this time. So we don't know whether they were or not.
Future research projects.
Exactly.
All right, 2 more questions. We've had a commenter saying that they're very interested in the descendant research that you're doing. Do you have any more comments on that?
So we are certainly actively pursuing finding descendants. From a research perspective, from what I can do at my end, that means trying to do things like take names of enslaved people and contemplate potential full names or last names that they might have used upon becoming free or after the era of slavery, and trying to track them down. It also means looking at resources like Freedmen's Bureau records or records of African Americans that ended up enrolling or enlisting in the U.S. Army in the Civil War, trying to find any that might say previously were enslaved at Ashland. So we're doing those things. We're also trying to find people, reach out, let people know. And we've had it on our website for years, but I think we're trying more actively now to get people out there to know that we want to know if you think you are. We have some folks that have presented some information, which we've done some research on. Thus far, we don't have any that we can, that the information, that the evidence is really significant for, but we hope to build a descendant community as we go forward.
Right. And lastly, what plans are there to reconstruct the slave cabins?
We haven't made a definite plan yet, and we've contemplated a number of options, including laying a set of stones out in approximately the right location and approximately the right size to give people a sense of scale and location. We've, everything to including building a whole building and furnishing it. That's very difficult to do.
Right.
We don't have records for what was in those buildings. We could probably find records or information from other sites and extrapolate something, but it may or may not be really, really accurate. So it's a challenging proposition. I hope we will do something at some point in the near future. How exactly that will be done remains to be seen.
Right. That's a tough one.
Right.
And we had one more pop in. Do the Clay family letters give news of the slaves and their lives? Ooh, that's an interesting one.
Yes. The enslaved people at Ashland are mentioned many times in the letters. Sometimes it's things, a lot of times it's things like Henry Clay writing to his son or to his wife or to an overseer saying, please tell so-and-so to go, make sure the cattle are run out every day, or take this horse to the neighboring farm, or whatever, harvest this crop, or those kinds of things. We have letters or documents, receipts, where we see things like the Clays bringing a doctor to Ashland, and that doctor often would, or sometimes would, treat the Clay family and any enslaved people that might need medical treatment at that time. We have a document from a very early ledger that Henry Clay kept, where he buys from his brother, who was a carpenter, a furniture maker, a coffin for an enslaved person. So we have lots of documents. We have some emancipation documents, not a lot. I think we've documented now 7 people that Henry Clay enslaved, which when you put that number next to the number that he bought and the number that we know were enslaved here is very, very small. So we do have mention of those sorts of things, in a number of ways, and those are very interesting. We've gone through all of those and collated those, and those are very useful in the interpretation we do.
Right. Oh, well, Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. And just got to say, you're my favorite museum mentor, my first museum mentor,
Well, thank
and
you so much, Caitlin.
such
That
a
means a great deal.
pleasure learning more from you today. So thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming back.
It's been great to be here. I very much appreciate the opportunity. It's great to see a number of our Ashland friends here. I think mom and dad are here, so happy anniversary. Thanks for joining. My wife may be here. I don't know. She's a lawyer, and depends on if she can get free from clients or not. But anyway, thanks for everyone for coming out and joining in, and it's been a great pleasure to do this. This has been a lot of fun.
Eric, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful program. And as soon as we can, we want to bring a group of volunteers down to Ashland, just as soon as
We'd love that. That would be
safe to
great.
be all gathered together. And if your mom and dad and your wife did miss this program, we are making a recording. So don't worry.
Great. We'll make sure they see
You
it.
can just watch this for days. We're so grateful for all of you for joining us today, to our event sponsors, John and Jeannie Vizo. And if you are on the Locust Grove email list, you will find out this Friday about our next very special lecture. So make sure that you are signed up. And if you want to get even earlier notice, you should become a member of Locust Grove. And while you're at it, a member of Ashland. henryclay.org is how you can become a member of Ashland. locustgrove.org is how you can support Locust Grove. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you back here again soon, and we hope to see you at either Ashland or Locust Grove from a safe physical distance, but a very warm social one very soon. Bye, y'all.